Does eccentric weightlifting or training always cause muscle damage? So I think it's a big question. Like, people use eccentrics for a lot of different reasons. And we know that this through science, like, this is undisputed, that the growth or the growth that you get from strength training or resistance training and how you apply the resistance to your body, we know you're probably going to get the better or the best response through the eccentric motion, or more specifically, like the down phase in a squat, or the down phase, in a bench press. And yeah, I hear that term. I don't like that term a lot. They call it negative, but it is kind of like, it's well recognized, but it's the negative that is the down to the lowering phase.
I haven't heard that in so long.
I haven't either.
Wow, right when you brought it, I was like, oh shit.
Yeah, so we talk about accentuated eccentric training a lot in our programming. But the question still remains, does it always cause the most muscle damage?
That is a good question.
It's almost like it's just a tricky question, right? Because scientifically, eccentric does cause more damage, right? Because you're ripping myosin heads off, right? But are you progressively overloading in that workout? Like, did you not increase from the last eccentric training?
So the term always is really the defining term here. And so I think we'll all agree that in general,
yes.
And yes, but it depends.
Yeah.
As with anything in training. So let's talk about that. So you just mentioned that. So what is actually happening in eccentrics that creates the quote unquote muscle damage that's happening?
Well, just from a really surface level perspective, the eccentric is when you are lengthening the muscle under load, against load. So you've lifted the weight, the muscle's contracted, and now you are starting to let the weight down. But what you're doing is resisting the weight as it descends. So you're producing force, but not enough force to lift the weight, just enough that it doesn't fall. So you're like letting the weight down instead of dropping it. Now, when this happens, this is where we're strongest. We are able to, it's not really lifting, but we're able to produce more force eccentrically than we can concentrically when we're lifting. So that's one reason why you can have somebody do like a forced negative, where you can have somebody push extra hard on the weight on the way down, and then they let go. The weight is now lighter. You're just using the weight on the bar and you lift it back up. There are also a lot of newer machines that actually change, like the tonal thing that a lot of people are buying for their houses. They have a mode on it where you can change it to produce more resistance eccentrically and then let it back up for the concentric. So because we're stronger there, well, Jeff will probably dive into the physiology, but essentially it causes more ripping of the myosin heads, like he said, on the contractile portions of the muscle.
Yeah, so you kind of look at it just like Velcro, right? Muscle, right? So you think of like the how Velcro, when you rip Velcro apart, there's basically little hooks, right? And they hook onto one another, and you pull it apart, and that's the same essentially thing as those fibers are gliding over one another, actin and myosin gliding over one another in those muscle fibers. That's essentially what you're doing. And it damages, again, it's almost like a dramatic word for lack of a better term, is sort of damaging that. And then the goal is that we take time to recover, right? And then that it improves the cross bridging,
creating the proper, inflammation response, right?
There's a lot of things that go into that. Nutrition, hydration, rest, relaxation, all those kind of things, de-stressing, hormonal responses, things like that. We come back bigger and stronger. So that's effectively kind of what's happening at the anatomy level. And so the answer to the question is it depends. If we're looking at eccentric training, it can be very valuable when done properly. But Jeff, you touched on something there a minute ago, just about the intensity of that training, as compared to, the intensity within whatever repetition or whatever that particular training session is, and whether or not it actually is damaging anything, or whether or not you're actually going to get any benefit out of it. You want to elaborate on that?
You're talking about the progressive overload. Yeah. So, for me, right, the eccentric is the most important part of every exercise, right? For me, I'm never going to pick a deadlift off the ground and drop the bar. Maybe on my last rep, dude, because I'm tired, but I am going through a full, very slow eccentric portion on that deadlift. almost like a tap and go, but I'm not letting the weight bang off the ground, right?
Yeah, there's an intention, as much intention on the way down.
Yes.
At putting it down as there was in picking it up.
Yeah, you're not just letting the weight pull you through, right? We're letting that, because what's happening is if I can increase, we're trying to work the posterior chain, right? Why am I going to neglect the most beneficial range in something like a deadlift to lift the concentric portion, right? Now, I guess you could argue when, maybe powerlifting Olympic lifting and things like that there could be a place for that, right? We're not trying to tax the posterior chain so much. And we're going to work on a concentric, drive or whatever, right? But for everyday people, the eccentric is extremely important. When we're talking about progressive overload, I need to add a little bit more resistance so I can get the adaptation right within the modality that I'm choosing. So for instance, if I come in and I do, like we're talking about force negatives, right? For 100 pounds, I'm just the arbitrary number. I'm using 100 pounds and I'm going to do, a force negative. I got to come in and I have to do more the next time just because eccentrics does damage. Let's say I do that same number and I'm thinking like I'm going eccentric training. I still have to progressively overload, right? In any modality, right? So like you're talking about the eccentric training, if I'm doing, endurance training, I need to do more endurance, cardio. I need to increase what I'm doing, right? As you know, and then cycle out to something new, right?
Or something different.
Exactly.
Right? As your body is responding and recovering and or may have, if you've been doing that endurance training, there's a give and take, right? Yeah. Been focused on your endurance, strength might take a hit, right? Power might take a hit. It's going to, so we're going to have to, your mobility might take a hit. Absolutely. Flexibility might take a hit. So as you focus on your performance goal, other things are going to,
they're going to disappear. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Or they're going to become, you may be, let's just say, deconditioned in these other capacities.
Which is fine. Right. Because as that deconditioning, like you're talking about, comes in, when I come back into that phase, now I might be a little stronger than when I came into it last time. But like you're saying, you are getting deconditioned. But then the great thing about that is it's a novel stimulus. Right. And guess what?
The response.
And I'm going to grow. And guess what?
Crazy
you can
gains.
do it for two or 3 weeks, right?
Crazy gains.
Easy gains.
Yeah, right? Because when we talk about science, 4 to 6 weeks, right, is, when the body adapts. And every person's going to be different within that. And then each phase of, strength, hypertrophy, what, your body type can maybe recover faster endurance wise, or maybe you can recover faster power wise, right? You have different fibers. You have more of a collection of one type of fiber. And just that being said, the growth is coming from those different cycles in training.
Right. And so going back to the eccentrics and making sure that we're paying as much attention to the eccentric as we are the concentric. If you're going through a strength phase, let's say, so you are that power lifter, right? Mm-hmm. And your goal is to pull as much weight off the floor as you possibly can. And I see a lot of this on right now. I don't know what it is on the gram. I see this shit everywhere. These kids are going into the gym and they're kids, they're young guys.
High school, college.
Whatever. Yeah. It's, let's just say they're definitely sub 25 years old, the best I can tell. And they're pulling as much weight as they can off the platform, right? Mm-hmm. They're barefoot, shirtless, whatever. They bring it up to their hips and then they're almost literally throwing it back onto the floor, right? Yeah. And then they get up and they clap and the chalk goes everywhere and they're giving the woohoos and they're dancing around the gym and everybody in the gym's looking at them like, what an asshole, because you are.
Yeah.
And then they step away from that and then it's just constant, like, let me put more weight on the bar. Let me put more weight on the bar. Guess what? Guess what's going to happen?
You're going to get hurt.
You're going to get fucking hurt.
And you're not going to adapt in a positive way.
That's the bigger piece.
So I'm really glad you bring that up. So let's say, let's bring it back to, say, somebody who's training for strength specifically. Do they need to accentuate the eccentric sometimes? Well, I'd say, yeah. I mean, obviously the answer is always, it depends, but there's definitely good reason to. For one thing, we still haven't established that muscle damage is the end all be all as far as hypertrophy response. Yes. We know that it plays a role, and we do know that the eccentric portion of a lift, provided the weight is heavy enough to overload you, is where the majority of muscle damage occurs. And we know they're linked, but there's a correlation, it's not a causation, right? There are still other reasons to accentuate eccentrics, besides just trying to get the most muscle growth as possible, especially if you are doing something that requires technical prowess, like strength training. If you are a powerlifter, you need to be good at deadlifting, not just strong enough to rip the weight off the floor, but you need to be good at the movement that is deadlifting. Also, if you're trying to build strength, that usually implies to some degree building muscle. I know there's a lot of training that's very low on the rep ranges. I see that as more as peaking. If you are in an off season as a powerlifter, your training volume is going to look very similar to a bodybuilder's, maybe lower rep sets, but total training volume should be higher because you are trying to build some muscle.
Yeah.
If you look at if you equate powerlifters across different weight classes, the stronger powerlifters have the more muscle, right? That's a very strong correlation. So anyway, not to digress too much. Let's say the deadlift, when you pick up a deadlift, and if you just immediately drop it, you now have to reset on the floor because there's no tension anywhere. If you lower it more under control, you're able to control exactly where the bar falls and exactly the position that your body is in when you prepare to lift it back up. At the same time, you maintain tension on the muscles that will assist in the lifting, most notably the posterior chain, which is really important.
Preloaded.
Let's look at like a conventional deadlift, right? Most people who do it are not using a lot of hamstring on the way up. They're using quad drive. And once the weight gets up to about, mid thigh level, they're using their glutes to lock out. If you lower it more slowly, if you especially lower it like an RDL almost where you're pushing your hips back and then allowing your knees to bend, and then you keep tension when you get to the bottom and then lift again, your hamstrings are still loaded. So they're actually going to assist on the way up now. And that's a huge weak link or missing link, depending on the person, for posterior chain training and people who try to specialize in the deadlift is your hamstrings suck. Yeah. The deadlift can train your hamstrings really well, but it also cannot. Yeah. And it all depends on how you go about your sets and your setup.
You might have to take some weight off the bar. I did. That's how I hurt myself. I couldn't load my hamstrings. I was coming in, butt winking, just rounding my back, not understanding how to keep a tall torso, load the hamstrings, sit back into the heels. You're falling into the balls because it's a conventional deadlift. The bar's in front of you, right? So a lot of people, and then they're in shitty shoes, right? The running shoes. Come on. Yeah. But you're falling forward on the balls, right? So, and I know you see a lot of bodybuilders, they put their toes up onto something, right? That's really to have them sit back into the heels and to pull their toes up so they can actually get into the more of a hamstring stretch to feel like an RDL type, like dumbbell RDL, right?
That's a really quick tangent I want to touch on because I've seen some quote unquote biomechanists like Paul Carter talking about how elevating your toes is fucking stupid. And I'm like, bro, you need to... He is absolutely right that it doesn't stretch the hamstrings to any meaningful degree or at all because your hamstrings don't attach anywhere on the foot. Ankle. Yeah. But what happens when you elevate your toes is your weight is shifted. Your weight shifts backwards, and so it is much easier for you to now have the assisted proprioception to keep tension on your hamstrings.
Where is that coming from, Jeff? Where is that? So what you mentioned is we know that the hamstring doesn't attach to the foot or the ankle, right?
Yeah.
However, everything's connected from the floor, from the bottom to the top. We have these fascial lines. I think this is what we're about to get into, which speak to the proprioception, right? Because you've now put something on stretch that is connected to the hamstring. So effectively, you are stretching the hamstring to some extent, right? Absolutely. Depending on how tight or
it blows me away that really smart people are taking things and saying like the hamstring doesn't attach to the ankle. Hey, dude, you're looking at gross anatomy. And to be honest, Western society anatomy really sucks, dude. We don't look at connective tissue and we kind of just focus on the muscle, right? But when we look
in isolation, we've broken it up into its constituent pieces, and there's not one part of the human body that works in isolation. No, not one.
Dude, when we look at the neck, right? You can literally, they look at the neck with what is it for the baby? This is, go over there to sonar, you can see the baby.
Oh, like an ultrasound?
Thank you, ultra fucking sound. God damn it, dude. So
kid guy didn't have kids.
Thank God. So you got the ultrasound on the neck, right? And they go and they move in the hamstring and they can see the neck fibers moving, right?
Yeah.
So everything's connected. And when we start looking, and this kind of changed my life, looking at fascial lines and the way that the body is connected from head to toe is going to dictates my movement now. And when I really focus on the way that those lines are moving and the way that we're supposed to move naturally through those, I have less pain, I have less restriction, my body's freer, I warm up less, right? So really playing in and looking at these lines, like when we rotate, like why do we rotate over the front leg forward? It's because my fascia switches positions. Like my hips are rotated one way, my body rotates the other, right? You would think that you're rotated to the right, but the body does a counter rotation to cause gait, right? Because we rotate, that's how we walk. We need to rotate, right? So I kind of went off on a little tangent there, but fascial lines, right? Learning the oblique slings, learning how everything kind of works in conjunction and kind of moving into that, let's call it functional patterns, right? can be a lot better, and especially for bodybuilding. Like if you have tight fascia, you're not going to be able to show your lats. You're not going to be able to show the scapular muscles and really pop, right? Like if you're tight in the shoulder blade and the shoulder girdle, you don't have control of that. You're
limited.
You're going to look like shit.
Yeah,
and why do you think all these bodybuilders are doing Graston and cupping right now? They're finally kind of understanding on a very subsurface level that they can have more aesthetics when that fascia is released. Well, why don't we train with the fascial lines and release the fascia so we can have that presentation of muscle? Right?
Yeah, the interesting part is the counterplay there, like going back to Caleb's point about putting the toes on the board or on the 2x4 plates or whatever it is, in that bodybuilding has always been about trying to break it out into its constituent pieces, right? Yep. But now you're comparing the bodybuilder and his or her intention to try to really get into the hamstrings on a particular deadlift, Romanian deadlift, whatever movement, like a hip hinging type movement. But in the contrast, we were also talking about the power lifter, right? And them being out of touch with their hamstrings.
Right.
And so there could be some benefit in putting in, maybe doing a little bit of lightweight training to get their toes up so that they do feel that stress, like, oh, that's where I'm supposed to be feeling, so that they can then translate that to sitting back.
Proprioception, dude. The fucking awareness.
Yeah, that's what he was saying.
You build awareness of this muscle functioning in this way. It's always functioned that way, but you haven't had that awareness of it. You know, for lack of better terms, you learn how to feel the muscle through the specific range of motion. And then you can apply that to your competition lifts later on. So all the way taking it back now to eccentric training for a powerlifter or somebody who's not just trying to induce a bunch of muscle damage, it makes a ton of sense. One, because it can influence the bar path, and the bar path is really important to be able to, you want to control it effectively. Yeah. Same thing with lowering a bench press. You want to lower it nice and slow and under control, because that way you control exactly the path the bar takes down to your chest. And so whatever path you take on the way down, you're probably going to take on the way back up. And if you take that path down nice and slow and make sure it stays in the same fucking track every rep for all of your training over the course of the years, come competition day, the bar is going to follow that path. And so you're not going to have an issue where you misgroove on competition day or even in training. The other reason that is basically the reason. And I'm just going to restate that controlling the eccentric allows you to improve your coordination of a movement, of a specific movement. And so just like there are reasons to do things ballistically, unless you're very, very solidified in that movement already, doing something ballistically is going to look fucking different every single time.
Well, exactly. So what's going to happen? Like you're talking about controlling the eccentric. What happens when you start speeding up? Like, oh, this is heavy, I want to get it. Your form breaks down, right? Unless
you've drilled it.
Unless you've drilled it properly.
Because your strongest motor pattern might not be the best one, right? So you're like, oh shit, I need to get this off me. You might shrug, you might do whatever, because that's the strongest pattern. You haven't set in now the real bench press. So you might have to pull weight off the bar, really focus on your body, right?
I would also add that if you have trained in that really effective and efficient way, and you do find yourself in that position where you're now pushing yourself beyond your limit or your known limit, and you do maybe shrug or you do round thoracic,
get away with it.
You're in a much better and safer place to be able to overcome that.
You haven't been drilling it like that all the time, and then that 5%.
And you'll
know, like, fuck.
You'll know because you have a reference point.
I really like that Jeff brought up the solidifying and thickening these neuromuscular pathways, because that's exactly what we're doing. Movements are skills. Whether you are training to perform those skills specifically, like a powerlifter, an Olympic lifter, or even athletes, right, who have to train in different types of sprint mechanics, jump mechanics, all these things, or a bodybuilder, your exercises as a bodybuilder are still skills. You want to be good at bench pressing or
training, right?
You want to be really good at it so you can do it fucking forever, because the best bodybuilder is the one who is able to do it for the most amount of years consecutively, continually improving without hurting themselves.
Longevity.
I like to compare this aspect of training to playing music a lot. If you have ever played any kind of classical music or any kind of music, you have been drilled in scales and they fucking suck. Because your teacher will always tell you, you have to practice the scales really fucking slow. And the reason you have to practice them slow is because that way you don't make mistakes. When I used to rush through my scales, I would make mistakes, and I'd find myself making the same exact mistake every time, because that's the neural pathway I built.
Yeah, you programmed it in there.
So you do it, you have to break it down like Jeff did with taking the weight off. You do it slow so that you can go through the whole thing multiple times without making mistakes. And then over time, you can start doing it faster, to the point where before I quit playing guitar, which is a big regret of mine, kind of, sort of. I wish I didn't stop, but before I quit, I could like carry on a conversation while going through a scale, and I wouldn't make mistakes on the scale, and I didn't have to think about it at all because the muscle memory was that integrated. That's what we're trying to do with movements.
So going back to the eccentrics, skip the whole, this is the muscle damage piece, right? And this is why I need to train it, and take it back to what you gain from a skills perspective and a connectivity perspective, so that you can get the gains that you want, regardless of where the muscle damage is or isn't.
Because it's going to happen.
As an added bonus, you probably will get a little more muscle damage, and you probably will build a little more muscle and a little more strength from that. So you should do it.